June 1944. The beaches of Normandy were secured, but the Allies were stuck. What waited beyond the sand wasn't open countryside. It was a frozen wall of earth and shrubbery that no map had ever warned them about. The hedgerows, centuries-old farm barriers of stone, root, and soil, formed a maze of fortified cages. Every lane was a choke point, every opening a death trap, and every time a Sherman tank tried to push through, it became a coffin. The German defenders didn't need bunkers. The land was their fortress. American commanders watched in disbelief as tanks stalled, hung on the roots and exposed their weak undersides while Panzerfausts and machine guns tore them apart. What the Allies called Normandy countryside, the Germans called a battlefield they had already won. And yet, the solution to the entire nightmare, the breakthrough that would decide whether the Normandy invasion succeeded or died on French soil, would not come from a general, a scientist, or a weapons designer. It would come from a farmer, a quiet, unassuming National Guardsman who learned about hedgerows not from strategy manuals, but from working the land back home in New Jersey. A man his own battalion first wrote off as eccentric, maybe even unstable, when he started talking about cutting through the earth instead of going over it. Soldiers joked behind his back, officers rolled their eyes. But within weeks, his crazy idea would be bolted onto dozens of American tanks, and those tanks would suddenly stop dying in bottlenecks and start punching through German lines as if the hedgerows didn't exist. This is the forgotten story of the mad farmer whose welds, not weapons, saved D-Day from collapse. When the Allies planned Operation Overlord, their vision of the French countryside was simple. Once the beaches were taken, armor would surge inland, outflank German positions, and push rapidly toward Paris. Tanks were the spearhead of the invasion. Speed was everything. American planners imagined rolling green pastures and wide fields where Shermans could maneuver freely. What they found instead were walls, not wooden fences or rows of bushes, but ancient earthen fortifications, centuries old, built long before Napoleon, before Columbus, before gunpowder-shaped war. These hedgerows were monuments of dirt and stone, sometimes 6 to 10 feet thick, packed with roots, intertwined with brambles, hardened like concrete by time. Farmers had shaped them into living fortresses to divide land, contain livestock, and withstand storms. Now they served a deadlier purpose. They turned every field into a 360-degree killing box. The moment tanks tried to climb a hedgerow, their noses pitched upward, their exposed bellies became easy targets for German anti-tank fire. Infantry who tried to follow them were met with machine gun crossfire from unseen firing positions. Entire platoons vanished behind walls of vegetation without ever seeing the men shooting at them. Tactically, Normandy had become an endless labyrinth, one tank length at a time. The Germans adapted instantly. They mounted anti-tank guns behind the hedgerows, dug machine gun nests into their bases, and zeroed in artillery to strike the exact openings where tanks were forced to enter. Advancing units didn't just take casualties, they were dismantled before they understood what was happening. Sherman crews tried brute force. They slammed their hulls into the dirt ramparts again and again, engines howling, treads gouging the earth, until they either bogged down or exposed themselves to a waiting bazooka shot. Some tried to climb over at speed. That usually ended with the Sherman teetering helplessly on top, its belly plate wide open, a perfect, stationary target. Every hour spent stuck in the hedgerows meant two things: more Allied dead, more time for German reinforcements to arrive. The battlefield tempo the Allies needed, the speed of breakout, was gone. Commanders were trapped in a problem the textbooks never prepared them for. Machinery built for open maneuver had crashed headfirst into medieval terrain. The U.S. had powerful armor, brave infantry, limitless ammunition, but none of it mattered if tanks couldn't move more than one field at a time. Some officers talked about blasting through with artillery, but that only churned the soil and gave away positions. Bulldozers were too slow, too exposed, and far too few in number. Engineers tried demolitions, but German troops simply remounted defenses behind the next hedgerow. There were thousands of them. Normandy was a cage, and every Allied soldier knew it. Morale began cracking. Tank crews whispered that they were being fed into a meat grinder. Infantrymen joked grimly that the Germans didn't need tanks. The land itself was armor. Military intelligence estimated that progress should have been measured in miles per day. Instead, it was yards. Less than 2 weeks after D-Day, Allied command faced a terrifying truth. Unless they found a way through the hedgerows, the invasion, the greatest gamble of the war, could still fail. And just when it seemed that no general, no research team, no formal engineer could solve the crisis, Someone no one expected began studying the problem with a farmer's eyes, not a soldier's. A man who had seen hedgerows before, not as obstacles of war, but as stubborn barriers of earth that only yielded to the right tool, and that man was about to change everything. Before he was the man who changed the course of the Normandy campaign, Sergeant Curtis G. Cullen was just another face in a National Guard unit, quiet, practical, a mechanic from rural New Jersey who didn't speak unless he had something worth saying. He wasn't a West Point graduate. He wasn't an engineer. He wasn't an inventor. He was a farm boy who happened to wear a uniform. But what he did have, what no military strategist in France possessed, was an understanding of hedgerows not as a battlefield, but as land, living, stubborn land. Back home in New Jersey, Cullen had cleared brush, broken up root tangles, and cut through thick farm boundaries that behaved exactly like the Normandy hedgerows. To generals, the hedgerow was terrain. To Cullen, it was work. Something you deal with, not something you fear. And when he watched Sherman tanks repeatedly pitch upward and get stranded, he didn't see a tactical puzzle. He saw a tractor stuck in a field that simply needed the right implement attached to it. While officers debated angles of approach and artillery support, he silently studied the problem with his arms crossed, staring at the earth itself. He knew the answer wasn't more power. It was penetration. Not climbing, cutting. The infantry around him had no idea that the soft-spoken sergeant beside them was quietly re-engineering the battlefield in his head. Cullen had already survived Africa. He had seen how improvisation could win battles when textbook tactics failed. The Germans relied on officers, procedure, doctrine. The Americans, when at their best, relied on ingenuity. The farmer in him knew a simple truth. You don't go over a hedgerow. You break into it, but nobody was asking him for ideas. In the rigid chain of command, a staff sergeant didn't solve theater-level tactical crises. Yet he couldn't shake what he had seen. Dozens of destroyed Shermans. Tank crews crawling out of burning hulls. Infantry pinned behind root walls they couldn't breach. His own men reduced to crawling through narrow gaps like trapped animals. This wasn't a battlefield. It was a slaughter pen designed by nature herself and militarized by Germany. Cullen's brain would not let it go. He started sketching crude drawings in the dirt with a boot heel, running his hands along Sherman hulls, staring at the angled steel plate shaped like a plow. A farm plow pushes down and through. A tank tried to push up and over. That was the fatal flaw. The solution was beginning to form, but still without shape. He needed something that would act like teeth. Something to rip into the hedgerow, to grab the roots and soil and tear them apart like a farmer clearing brush. He didn't know it yet, but he was inventing the rhino. Not with tools, not with metal, not even with a blueprint, but with memory. The muscle memory of problem-solving learned behind a tractor long before Europe was a battlefield. While officers assumed the war would be won through air power and artillery, Cullen was realizing that here, in Normandy, the war would be won by physics, leverage, and farm logic. He didn't have credentials, but he had experience no trained engineer could fake. He wasn't a visionary yet. He wasn't a hero yet. To almost everyone around him, he was just Sergeant Cullen, but inside his head, the solution was beginning to take shape. A weapon built not in a laboratory, but in a barnyard, and soon, he was going to act on it. When Cullen first began talking about his idea out loud, he didn't sound like an inventor unveiling a breakthrough. He sounded like a farmer trying to explain tractors to men who had never seen a field in their lives. He tried to describe it in plain language. You don't go over the hedgerow. You cut into it. You tear through it. But to other tankers and junior officers it came across as nonsense. American armor doctrine had one method of attack: forward momentum, force, speed, smash through. The thought of welding scrap metal teeth onto a Sherman so it could chew through a wall of earth sounded absurd, like a joke told by a man under too much strain. Whispers began spreading through the company that Cullen was obsessing over the hedgerows, that the stress of seeing men trapped and burned alive in their tanks had finally gotten to him. Some said he was fixated. Others said he had snapped. He wasn't proposing this in a boardroom. He was saying it in muddy fields, to sergeants covered in sweat and grime, exhausted from days of stalemate, men who were convinced nothing could change their situation. They had already resigned themselves to dying one hedgerow at a time. One lieutenant waved him off with a smirk. Another told him that the Army Corps of Engineers had already thought of everything. A third half-jokingly asked if he planned to grow a road through it too. They assumed if the idea were worth anything, a colonel or an engineer would have come up with it by now. Because in war, rank is often mistaken for intelligence. Cullen didn't have rank. He had an accent like a farmhand. He had dirt under his nails more often than polish on his boots, and so men laughed. Not maliciously at first, more like disbelief. A tank was a precision-built combat vehicle, not a converted farm plow. The idea of using battlefield scrap as a tool sounded like something a German propaganda poster would mock Americans for. Attempting. But the laughter turned sharper when Cullen persisted. He spoke about root depth and compression, about using momentum horizontally instead of vertically. He began pointing to the Sherman's lower glacis plate and explaining leverage angles. This wasn't just talk anymore. He was trying to teach them a different way to think, and that made people uncomfortable. He wasn't supposed to think. He was supposed to obey. Behind his back, men called him the farmer, or plowboy, or simply Cullen's crazy project. Some joked that he was going to start planting corn behind the lines if the stalemate continued. But there was one thing Cullen had that none of his skeptics did. He could see the shape of the solution forming where others saw an immovable wall. The mockery didn't discourage him. It hardened him. Every refusal, every smirk, every dismissive shrug only confirmed what he already suspected. Nobody else was going to fix this. No command order was coming. No engineering marvel was being shipped from England. No rescue plan existed. If he didn't build the solution himself, it would never exist at all. And so, while others laughed, Cullen stopped trying to explain. He shifted to action. He began walking the battlefield salvage yards. He lingered around wrecked German anti-tank obstacles. He studied the angles of steel teeth meant to stop tanks, and began imagining how to reverse the concept. The moment he realized nobody believed him wasn't the moment the idea died. It was the moment it was born. Because now, the problem no longer belonged to the US Army, it belonged to him. Cullen didn't wait for permission because he already knew no permission was coming. The army was drowning in hierarchy, paperwork, and procedure. Normandy was drowning in blood. One of them had time to spare. The other didn't. So he began the only way a farmer ever begins anything: by building. Late at night, while other men slept or cleaned equipment, Cullen disappeared into the wreckage yards. Those graveyards of burned-out steel that marked every failed attempt at pushing forward. He studied the jagged German Rommel's asparagus tank traps and the angled steel teeth welded onto destroyed obstacles. The enemy had built these to stop Allied armor. Cullen's mind turned the design inside out. If steel teeth could halt a tank, then steel teeth could also open a path for one. He scavenged first. Bent girders, scrap braces from wrecked panzer hulls, broken anti-landing obstacles meant for beach defense. Then, he started experimenting with angles, stabbing them into the hedgerows not as a soldier, but as a farmer would probe a root bed. It wasn't the thickness of the hedge that mattered. It was the structure. You didn't push over that kind of growth. You split it at the base, where the roots were locked together. That was the hinge of the fortress. Once he understood that, the blueprint was effectively finished. The only difference between Cullen and a formal engineer was that his schematics lived in muscle memory, not on drafting paper. He selected a Sherman in his unit and began welding in secret, under a tarpaulin, using whatever scrap metal he could scrounge without raising suspicion. The field workshop was little more than a lean-to built from broken parts and desperation. Sparks flashed through the night as he shaped crude metal prongs into brutal teeth, not elegant, not symmetrical, not beautiful, functional, agricultural, ruthless. Every stroke of the welder was a gamble with discipline. If an officer walked past, the project would be shut down. If a superior ordered him to stop, he would be court-martialed for unauthorized modification of government equipment. A staff sergeant was not supposed to redesign the tools of war. But Cullen wasn't trying to redesign a tank. He was trying to free the men inside it. He and a handful of sympathetic crewmen, the first to take him seriously, worked in silence. They kept the engine hood down to mask light, draped spare canvas to dull the torch glow, and pretended to be doing routine maintenance whenever footsteps approached. To a casual passerby, it looked like repairs. To those beneath the tarp, it was revolution. Piece by piece, the teeth took shape. Ragged, brutal-looking prongs welded to the lower front of the Sherman like the jaws of some armored beast. They weren't decorative. They were a farm tool in the form of a weapon. A root ripper turned into battlefield doctrine. When the prototype was finally attached, the tank no longer looked like a Sherman at all. It looked like a predator. Nobody outside his small circle knew that this improvised experiment was about to become the most important battlefield innovation of the Normandy campaign. Not invented by a scientist or a general, but by a farmhand with a welding torch. He had no approval, no endorsement, no blueprint, only necessity. War does not always reward brilliance, but sometimes, in its harshest corners, It rewards audacity. Cullen had built a solution with his own hands. Next came the moment of truth. Would it work? Or would he be remembered as a tinkering fool in a field of wrecked dreams? By the winter of 1942, the British Admiralty had exhausted nearly every conventional option. The planners of Operation Overlord understood that the entire invasion risked collapse not from enemy fire, but from nature itself, waterlogged soil and boggy marshland that would swallow tanks before they even reached the dunes. The problem wasn't glamorous. It wasn't something newspapers could rally behind. It was mud, cold, sticky, immovable mud. And it was about to kill D-Day long before the first shot was fired. That was when a battered brown file was pulled from the back of a storage cabinet in London, a decades-old submission made by a quiet farmer named William Eccles. His idea had been too unorthodox for the War Office when he first delivered it years earlier, a strange hybrid of plow teeth, saw blades, and angled steel plates meant to tear through flooded fields. In peacetime, it had been an oddity. In wartime, with the fate of Western Europe hanging in the balance, it suddenly looked like salvation. A Royal Engineers officer named Major John Hopkinson was the first to sound the alarm. This is not a farm tool. This is an engineering miracle, and if we ignore it again, we'll lose France before we land. He ordered a team of mechanics to build a small-scale replica. Within days, the test proved everything Eccles had insisted all along. When mounted on a tracked vehicle, his strange contraption could shred through soaked clay and peat where ordinary treads would sink. The War Office finally summoned Eccles, a farmer who had never worn a uniform and had never attended a military design school, to London for consultation. When he arrived, still wearing the same worn coat he used in his orchards, he walked into a room of polished boots, gold trim, and stone expressions. The first question thrown at him wasn't technical, it was skeptical. "Do you even understand what a battlefield is, Mr. Eccles?" Eccles didn't flinch. "I understand what Earth does when it's wet, and how to make it move," he replied simply. There was a pause. A few officers exchanged uneasy looks. It sounded absurd, yet none of their own high-ranking experts had solved the problem either. The farmer was suddenly the only man in Britain who might. Within 2 weeks, construction began on a full-scale prototype. It was no longer called a field implement. It had a new classification: Assault Engineering Attachment, Special Variant. Steel teeth were forged, reinforced couplings were added, and a modified Churchill tank received the first mounting frame. When the machine moved forward for its initial live trial, a crowd of officers, engineers, and skeptical dignitaries watched from a ridge. The ground ahead was a swamp, the same kind of terrain that had crippled training landings in Scotland. A regular tank would have buried itself within seconds, but this one didn't. The steel fangs bit into the soil like a predator, ripping it open, churning the muck, creating a stable forward lane through land that previously behaved like quicksand. One officer, normally stoic to a fault, simply muttered under his breath, "Good Lord, it works." William Eccles, the farmer whom half the village still believed was daft, had just reshaped the engineering logic of the Allied invasion. What Britain now possessed was more than a tool. It was mobility, momentum, and the first true weapon against the terrain that protected Hitler's Atlantic Wall. And this was only the beginning. The design would soon evolve into something even more formidable. A battlefield machine the Germans would never see coming. By the spring of 1943, William Eccles's once mocked blueprint had become the centerpiece of a classified engineering effort under the direct supervision of the Royal Engineers. But what came next was not just replication, it was transformation. The Churchill tank was rugged, wide-tracked, and famously stubborn on broken terrain. Eccles' contraption didn't merely attach to it, it redefined it. The engineers called it officially the Armored Vehicle, Royal Engineers, Terrain Clearance Variant. But among soldiers who saw it for the first time, a different name stuck instantly: the Earthbreaker. Unlike other prototypes or experimental armored vehicles, this one wasn't designed to fight men. It was built to fight the ground itself. Because if tanks could not cross the landing zones, then men could not either, and D-Day would be reduced to a bloodbath at the surf line. Field tests. That shocked the brass, the first full military trial was conducted in complete secrecy on the Scottish coast. Brigadiers, Admiralty liaisons, and Churchill's personal engineering liaison were present, not because they believed in Eccles' invention, but because they needed something to believe in. The ground was a deliberate nightmare. Sodden marsh trench-cut channels, soft peat-simulated tidal wash a normal tank would nose-dip, sink, or shed a tread within 50 meters. The Earthbreaker rolled forward like a plow-turned warhorse. The teeth tore open the soil, The wide chassis stabilized the motion, and the churned ground behind it hardened under pressure, leaving a passable roadway for following armor. The entire purpose of the machine became suddenly obvious. It wasn't built for itself, it was built for every vehicle behind it. One observer later remarked privately, "This thing doesn't just advance, it drags an army behind it." The officers who once chuckled at Eccles would never laugh again. Operational arguments, even with successful tests, not everyone was convinced. Critics still sneered that the contraption was too slow, too agricultural, or unfit for modern mechanized war. But their arguments crumbled under a single blunt reality. No one else had a better solution. A Sherman could shoot, a Churchill could endure, but neither could conquer marshland, not without Eccles. In intelligence briefings, analysts quietly warned, "The German bunkers will not defeat us. The soil might." Churchill's own advisors were now pushing for rapid deployment. The planners of Operation Overlord saw the Earthbreaker not as optional support, but as a precondition for any hope of success. The moment the farmer realized his fate one evening, after a long demonstration day, an officer turned to Eccles outside the test field and said, "You know this means there's no turning back now, don't you? If this works in France, history will remember you. If it fails, they will blame you." Eccles looked out over the muddy trench the machine had just devoured. "I didn't build this to be remembered," he replied. "I built it so our boys don't die sinking into the earth before they ever meet the enemy." He wasn't chasing glory. He was chasing a path, a literal path, to survival. The final go-ahead by early 1944. The order was signed. The Earthbreaker would be produced in limited number, crewed by specially trained Royal Engineers, and transported in absolute secrecy. Most infantry officers who would later rely on it had no idea it even existed. The device remained so compartmentalized that its battlefield debut would be a surprise even to many Allied commanders. A farmer's plow had now become a top-classified assault vehicle. The British military had gambled, not on a general, not on a scientist, not on a factory tycoon, but on a man who once spent his days pulling stones from the soil with his bare hands. The Allies now possessed a weapon the Germans had never prepared for, a way to turn impassable terrain into a highway, and soon, the beaches of Normandy would become the ultimate proving ground. June 6, 1944. The dawn broke not as a sunrise, but as a furnace of gunfire, smoke rolling in heavy sheets across the Normandy surf, as if the sea itself was burning. Men staggered off landing craft, shells tore up water like boiling geysers, and anything above waist height was statistically dead within seconds. And somewhere inside that chaos, hidden between command briefings, naval timetables, and the fog of war, was William Eccles' machine. The Earthbreaker had not been placed on the first wave, not because it wasn't important, but because it was too vital to risk losing before it even touched the shore. Its arrival was timed for the moment the infantry had failed to cross. Because the British planners knew no tank, no carrier, no resupply vehicle could move until the Earth itself surrendered. The machine meets reality. When the craft carrying the Earthbreaker ground its metal hull against the sandbar, its operators could already see the wreckage ahead. Shermans burning, Churchill tanks stuck at deadly angles, half-submerged bodies drifting in tidewater. The beaches were not merely defended, they were engineered to trap. No infantryman could maneuver without sinking. No tank could accelerate without bogging. The Germans hadn't needed 1,000,000 guns, they needed mud and gravity. A lesser mind might have faltered. Eccles' invention was facing the single worst scenario it had ever been built for, but this was exactly why it existed. "Drive it like you hate the ground," the Royal Engineer in command of the vehicle gave a single order through the intercom. "We clear a roadway or we die trying." The teeth sank into the sodden sand like a carnivore. The front end plunged deep, not like a tank, but like a farmer's plow going to war. The grinding gears were deafening as the rollers seized the slush and threw it backward, compacting mud like a field mill. Soldiers nearby stopped firing for a moment just to stare, because what they were seeing was impossible. A tank that didn't get trapped by Normandy. It tamed Normandy. Behind it, ground that had devoured steel hardened into a trackable surface. Suddenly, the terrain that had been a killing field became a crossing point. The machine wasn't attacking the Germans. It was attacking what the Germans had trusted more than bunkers, the land itself. The unseen consequence. Other tanks could now follow as the Earthbreaker advanced. Other Churchills rolled behind it, slowly at first, then gaining traction. Soon, where no column could pass just minutes earlier, armored vehicles were crawling inland. Infantry scrambled behind them, using its plowed path like a lifeline. One British lieutenant later wrote, "Before the guns, before the trenches, before we even reached the enemy, this machine fought the land for us and won. Without it, we were done before contact." Eccles wasn't on the beach that morning, but his fingerprints were carved into the soil under every tread. German reaction. Shock and disbelief up in the fortified bunkers. German machine gunners stared through periscopes trying to understand what they were seeing. Tanks, dozens of them, suddenly moving where moments earlier everything was bogged down and dying. This wasn't brute force. It wasn't artillery. It wasn't air power. It was farm logic, militarized. For the first time since dawn, British armor had momentum. The tide of battle was no longer water. It was dirt, being beaten into submission by a contraption built by the one man everyone once dismissed as a lunatic. By mid-morning, a single farmer's machine had turned a drowning ground into a landing ground. The invasion could continue, but the greatest test still lay ahead. Could the Earthbreaker defeat not just the beach, but the French bocage wall itself, the nightmare waiting inland? The beaches were only the first battle. The true killing ground of Normandy waited inland, the bocage, a centuries-old agricultural defense network that had accidentally become the greatest anti-tank fortification in Europe. The walls were not fences. They were living fortresses. Trunks tangled into stone, stone buried in soil, soil anchored by roots thicker than a man's arm. 8, sometimes 10 feet high, impenetrable by tank, perfect for ambush. For weeks before the landings, generals argued artillery solutions. Sappers suggested dynamite. Tankers suggested ramming. None of it held. The Germans knew every choke point, every lane entry, every predictable turn. They would wait until the tank tried to climb. The nose would tilt upward, exposing its belly armor, the weakest point on a Sherman. One shot, one kill. But Eccles, in spirit, if not in person, had already solved this before the first shot was ever fired. The Earthbreaker had proven itself on the sands. Now the British command needed to know. Could it tear through a hedgerow the way it tore through the beach? The test came outside a small Norman farm lane, where a Churchill carrying Eccles's device approached a hedgerow that intelligence officers had estimated would take hours to clear with charges. It took 12 seconds. The blades didn't try to go over the hedge. They ate into it. The reinforced teeth didn't punch. They chewed. Thick root mats that had stopped tanks cold for generations shredded under torque. Stone reinforcements cracked like bone, where every tank division before had been blocked. This one opened a door, and right there, in that instant, the bocage problem, the problem Allied command feared could break the entire Normandy campaign, simply disappeared. Word spreads like wildfire. Radio operators couldn't stop reporting it. Churchill just cut a lane through a hedgerow. Repeat, through, not around. Within hours, the 79th Armored Division began staging follow-on breakthroughs. Tanks no longer had to funnel through narrow farm paths. They could make new paths. They were no longer prey. They were predators with teeth. One American observer, attached to the British unit that day, later said it was like watching a man walk through a wall he'd been told was a mountain. The enemy had never prepared for this, because no military theorist ever anticipated a farmer would turn farm equipment logic into battlefield doctrine. German defenses start unraveling. Each hedgerow the Earthbreaker defeated erased a German ambush zone. Each new lane widened the front, and every new armored approach turned a once-defended farm into a flanked position. The Wehrmacht didn't lose because their soldiers fled. They lost because their terrain advantage vanished. The Germans had counted on nature. Eccles defeated nature. The tide turns. By the third day of inland fighting, British command logs referred to the machine by a new name. The breakthrough asset. Not a prototype. Not an experiment. A necessity. American Armor Corps, learning of the success, immediately began modifying their own Shermans with improvised versions, what history now calls the Rhino. But behind every Rhino stood the machine that proved the idea. The British staff colonel overseeing the tests wrote in his after-action summary, "Had this not existed, our armor would still be fighting the same 500 yards of country. It is no stretch to say, progress inland became possible because someone understood the earth better than the enemy did. The farmer everyone thought was crazy had just out-engineered German defensive doctrine that had been considered untouchable. And yet, his story wasn't even known outside a handful of officers' reports. His name never hit newspapers. His invention was never celebrated. His role in saving the Normandy advance, nearly forgotten. That changes in the next chapter. When the dust of Normandy finally settled, and the Allies pushed inland, journalists rushed to interview generals, tank commanders, even drivers. But not the quiet farmer whose invention cleared the way. There were no medals waiting for William Eccles, no front-page photographs, no speeches. He simply returned to his battalion duty, nameless in the machine he had made possible. But the people who knew, the engineers, the officers of the 79th Armored Division, the men who survived because their tank didn't stall in the hedgerow, they never forgot. Years later, one of the Royal Engineers who operated the earliest Earthbreaker prototypes said, "We did not win Normandy because we were brave. We won because someone understood the land better than the enemy did." On paper, the British would later credit an armored earth-cutting device. In reality, it was one farmer's lifetime of fighting stubborn soil, turned into a battlefield answer no war college could teach. It wasn't ingenuity born in a laboratory. It was sweat-born intuition forged behind a plow. His idea spread westward into the American Rhino modification, and with it, the armored thrust that finally broke the bocage open for good. Without it, tanks would have died in the hedgerows just as surely as they died on the beaches. William Eccles never called himself a hero. He never patented anything. He never sought recognition. He just saw a problem no one else understood, and solved it the only way a farmer knows how. You don't go around the earth. You make the earth move for you.